thrilled to be here in Austin. I've never been out for the LoneStarRuby conference before, but I've heard about it for years. And I'm really grateful to Lance and to Nola Stowe for pushing me to get here. I am a little bit challenged sometimes when it comes to things like, returning email, any kind of organizational thing, not my forte. So I really appreciate Lance pushing to get me here. The last time I was in Austin was when Rails Conf was here, and that was in the month of April. And the weather's a bit different this time of year, I've discovered. Because I'm from San Francisco. This is what a normal morning in July looks like for me. So yesterday, when it was 93 degrees out, I started thinking maybe this is a horrible idea. This is a horrible idea to come to Austin in July. But then I found this. You guys, this stuff is amazing. This is from the Sputzel Brewery in Shiner, Texas. It's their seasonal summer beer. It has grapefruit and ginger in it. And now that I found this, I think you might never get rid of me. Anyway, so when I was first practicing this talk for some of my coworkers a couple of months ago, I ran through the whole thing, and one of them turned to me and said, Sarah, you are not wearing enough eyeliner to pull off that title. And I said, excuse me? And he said, well, that title is too goth. This is a really fun talk. You shouldn't scare people like that, right? I mean, this is what I was expecting. I was expecting dreariness and black lipstick and gargoyles and fear and loathing and more eyeliner, for sure, more eyeliner. So I thought about that for a while, and I thought, I don't really do eyeliner. So I decided to give my talk a title that describes what it actually is about, which is work, play, and code. Less eyeliner for me, more accurate description of content for you. So I'm going to talk about how we think about how we work. But before I get into it, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. This is me on all of the important parts of the internet, which is basically just Twitter and GitHub. I'm a Ruby developer in San Francisco. For the last 3 years, I was at Pivotal Labs working with clients on their Rails projects. And I am also the co-founder of RailsBridge, which is we're now 4 years old, which is pretty awesome. We try to make our communities more welcoming to newcomers. We've done hundreds of events in places all over the world. And we've introduced several thousand people to Ruby and Rails. And we just did one on Friday here in Austin, which was super fun. So that's me. My work at Pivotal was working with clients, as I mentioned, and most of my clients were organizations that were growing rapidly. And specifically, they were growing rapidly by adding developers to their team. So what I did with them was to help them build a product and also help them build a team. And out of those two things, the team and the product, what I've discovered is that building the product is way easier. Growing an engineering team the right way is a really, really hard problem. Even being a developer, not a manager, but just a developer on a team that is growing quickly is a really hard problem. So this talk comes out of those experiences and some research that I've done on my own. So getting back into it, and so to get started, and I'm sure nobody in this room who has come to a Ruby conference on a Saturday falls into this category, but who has fun writing Ruby code? Okay, just checking. Thank you. I do talks sometimes at non-Ruby conferences, and you'd be surprised what I get from that one. Okay, so I love Ruby. I love Ruby. I love the language. It's a beautiful language. A few months ago, Ruby turned 20. Ruby is now 20 years old. At the Mountain West Ruby conference a few months ago, Matt said that 20 is the legal age of adulthood in Japan. So that means Ruby is now a grown-up. What he didn't mention is that 20 is also the legal drinking age in Japan. So as far as I'm concerned, the most important part of this milestone is that Ruby is now old enough to have a beer. Although, to be clear, can't have any of mine. So the language itself is awesome, but what I love about being a Ruby developer, maybe even more than the language itself, is the community. And Naps has mentioned this in a bunch of talks over the last year. Rubyists love events. We love talking to each other. That's really unusual in a technical community. And personally, I just love hanging around you guys. I'm just going to put that out there. I've never been in a developer community that was more creative, more social, had so many other interests besides code, or so many interesting projects to work on. But many of us in this room have a problem. And the problem looks like this. It looks like success. Ruby has been amazingly successful. We've gone from a fringe language to almost a mainstream language in just a couple of years. And as a result, many of the things that used to be small have gotten bigger. Symptom number one, In the last year, we started seeing conference talks and blog articles and even books start to show up around this topic of what happens when your Rails app grows up. We're talking about Rails engines. We're talking about software architecture. We're talking about services. We're talking about object design. And even DHH, as much as he hates what he calls over-design, is engaging on this question because it's important right now to a lot of us. And these things aren't important in a small code base. And what this tells us is that many of us are hitting the same growing pains at the same time. Our code bases have started out small, have gotten big. Symptom number 2, anyone in this room remember when Twitter was 12 engineers? Thank you, Josh. Okay, a few other people. That was a long time ago, you guys. That was a really long time ago. And they're not the only one, right? Companies that made their money on a Ruby product or doing Ruby consulting, they've grown, they've IPO'd, they've been acquired. And as a result, we are finding ourselves working in larger teams within larger organizations. And you can see that in the way that we discuss things like remote work, for example. Small companies have gotten big. And symptom number 3, really, really big companies have started getting into Ruby. I have talked to people from HP, from IBM, from GE, and these companies are throwing their thousands and thousands of engineers into Ruby, which is a pretty amazing thing. And at a more personal level, I've had a lot of people tell me the same story over the last couple of years, and the story is something like this. They're a developer. They went to work for a little company building a product in Ruby. At first it was amazing, total freedom to set technical direction and change it as needed as the business figured out what it wanted to be. They could keep the whole code base in their head, and then the product started making a little money. So they hired another engineer. And single decision-making power turned into a committee of 2, then a committee of 3, then the product made some more money, hired some more engineers, and the team just kept getting bigger, bigger, and this little company is becoming a big company, right? With a big code base, and one day they realize that they've got so many engineers that it's too chaotic. And they start thinking about splitting teams to reduce the overhead of managing this sort of many-to-many relationship. And they experiment with adding process to reduce the chaos, but everything they add seems to irritate people and push them away instead of making things better. And some of them hire managers who don't write code to manage people. And that doesn't end well. And they're afraid. They can see it coming. They're afraid of turning into this. They're afraid of becoming a place where there's so much process that it takes a week to make a decision that they would have made in 10 minutes before, where experimentation and chaos are replaced by research and meetings. The growth of an organization, if it's done thoughtlessly, can suck all of the creativity and inventiveness out of developers' jobs. And when that happens, the quality of the solutions drops. Now, companies do this for a reason, of course, and that's because creativity and inventiveness are chaotic forces. And as a team grows, you often add development process in response to too much chaos, right? Someone accidentally drops the production database. So you add a process for accessing it. But you need to be really careful because software development needs some chaos. We are solving difficult problems that are important to our society, and we need creative thought. We need some of this chaos. Now, unfortunately, much of the advice that business schools will give you about growing an engineering team leads you down this path of suppressing chaos in all of its forms. So the question that I'm interested in is, for organizations that are still small, how do we keep ourselves from becoming this? And for organizations that are already growing, how do we as individual developers keep the fun and creativity in our jobs as the organizations grow around us? Now, as a community, we actually talk about this a lot. Not explicitly very often, but this conversation is implicit in a lot of the other conversations we have. Here's one that happens a lot. There'll be a blog post. It'll probably be at the top of Hacker News and Reddit, right? And it'll say, there's 2 sides. As a developer, you are on one side or you are on the other. If you're an established company person, what you like is process. You're very focused. You know what you're building. You're determined, you're unwavering, and the other side would say that you have tunnel vision. And if you're a startup person, you're creative, you have a lot of ideas, you value disruption, and the other side would say that you're a little immature. Now, these categories can have lots of different headers. If you're talking to Paul Graham, who founded Y Combinator, which is a Silicon Valley VC firm that backs groups of 20-somethings in their garages, these are your headers. At the Waza conference earlier this year, one of the speakers, a guy named Rands, gave them these headers. But no matter who's talking about it, right, it's clear that what they mean is that you as an individual developer at any given point in your life are in one of these categories or you are in the other. You may move between them, right? Paul Graham seems to think you do as soon as you hit 30. But the assumption here is that these are different types of people. And some folks will go as far as to assert that you need both of these types of people in your organization in order to balance stability and growth. We'll come back to that in a moment. But right now, I want to bring something into this conversation that we haven't had before, and that's science. All of these blog posts are really one person generalizing from their experience, right? And that can be useful. But I'd like to remind you of something my dad, who had a PhD in chemistry, used to say. And that is that a collection of anecdotes does not add up to conclusive data. So let's look at some data. Let's start with creativity, because if you look at these lists, the generalization here is that the stable side is boring and uncreative, and the volatile side is fun and creative. And all of the other judgments, or all of the other properties, rather, flow from those judgments. So let's look at the science around creativity for a moment. In the 70s, scientists did some really fascinating work on the qualities of creative people. They took two groups, people identified by their peers as creative and people identified by their peers as uncreative, and they looked for statistically significant differences between the groups. Here are some things that did not matter. Intelligence. People with high IQ no more likely to be creative than people with average IQ. Age. Older people no more likely to be creative than younger people. Gender. Men no more likely to be creative than women. White people no more likely to be creative than black people. In short, what they found was there were no statistically significant innate differences between people who were creative and people who were not creative. But what they did find were differences in behavior and in habits. Now, I'll come back to what those differences are in a moment, but I think it might help at this point to define creativity, because we all have a feeling for what it is. But science has been thinking about this for a while. Let's see what they think. Scientists actually distinguish between two modes of thought that human beings engage in. And in psychological literature, these are called closed mode and open mode. When you're in closed mode, you are getting specific things done. Psychologists call this being executive. Your goals are very specific, you're very focused on them. And in open mode, you may have general goals, but what you're doing typically isn't very focused. You're open to new connections. And it's in open mode where creative thought can occur. So the first part of being a creative person is just knowing how to move between these modes of thought in a deliberate way. Now, at this point, you might think that these lists look a little bit familiar, right? Because they look a lot like those categorizations we've been doing in our community and that we do to ourselves, right? Am I a big company person or a small company person? Am I a stable or a volatile? And it turns out that the people who would like to put us in one of these categories have hit upon a real dichotomy in human thought. But these aren't different types of people. These are simply different modes of thought. And the critical error comes when we say that a person, an individual, is one or is the other, because we are all both at different times. And when I realized that, it took me a while to understand the implications there. A person may be more comfortable in one mode of thought or the other, but we are all capable of both, and we need both. And we all do a decent amount of switching between them without even realizing it. So when people say that you need both of these things to balance against each other, they're right. That's actually true. We need both of these modes of thought in software development. Each of us needs to be able to do both, but a technical leader shouldn't be trying to hire these archetypes and then keep them in tension with each other. A technical leader's goal should be to allow their people to do both of these things at the right times. And at this point, I think it's still fair to ask, what does being creative have to do with software development? Isn't what we do computer science? That's what my degree says. My brother, who's a pharmacist, thinks of what I do mostly as typing. You know, what does what we do have to do with art or poetry or music or humor or dance, right? Those things are creative. Isn't what we do kind of mechanical by comparison? I've never been a professional artist. I'm just a consumer of art. And as a consumer of art, what I see is the result. I see the sculpture, I see the dance. And as far as I can tell, until recently, what I thought how this worked, is that these are produced by an artist who goes into a cave, does a bunch of stuff I don't understand, and comes out with their work of genius. Turns out it's completely wrong. This lady is an American dancer and choreographer named Twyla Tharp. She is 71 years old, and at 71 is still considered one of the most creative forces in contemporary dance. And she wrote a fantastic book called The Creative Habit. And the core of it is the process she uses when she's coming up with a new dance. And this happens over the course of several months. First in the morning, she dances her standard routines. And for several hours, she's moving her body in very familiar ways, things that she's done for 30 and 40 years. She's executing, she's very comfortable. And then in the afternoon, she works on coming up with new movements. And the movement she does in the morning serves as the raw material and gives her a basis that she can then refactor into something new in the afternoon. Her process moves her deliberately between the closed mode in the morning and the open mode in the afternoon. She needs both to come up with a new dance, because if all she does is dance the old moves, she'll never come up with anything new. But if all she does is noodle around with new stuff, she lacks the base from which creative change can be made. Her creativity isn't a lightning strike out of nowhere, although that's what it looks like when you see her dances up on the stage. It's a repeating, methodical habit that gets her in the best situation for inspiration to strike. And that lines up with the science, right? People who are creative have simply developed habits that deliberately move them between the closed and open modes of thought. And it's movement between them that's key, because each one feeds the other. Let me show you what this looks like when you're writing code. Hopefully this should look familiar. People do this? Yes? This is not the first time you said, okay, good. So first you write a failing test, then you write the code that makes it pass, then you refactor the code to try and make it better. Now in practice, of course, it's more like this, right? You sort of do red, green, you get some standalone portion of the feature done, and then you go and refactor. And just to give you a concrete example, just in case you've never seen this before, think about adding a method to a Rails model. You have a model for a bus, and you need a method that tells you how many iPads are on the bus. So you write a model spec that fails, then you write the method into the model class. Model spec goes green, and then you realize the story you're working on actually asks for registered iPads. Okay, so you add another line to the spec goes red again. Then you implement it in the model, and everything's green. Then you sit back and you look at it for a moment, and yeah, you kind of realize maybe this stuff doesn't belong in the model exactly. And at this point, you have thousands of options for what you could do with this code. You could leave it where it is. Tests are green, it's working. You could extract it into a class. You could extract parts of it and leave parts of it in the model. You could reimagine your domain model. You could rewrite the whole thing in Elixir, right? You've got lots of options. And at this point, you've gone into the refactoring phase. So let's talk a little bit about what's different between these two phases of the cycle. Okay? First, the words we say change. I suppose if you're pairing, this is what you say out loud. If you're soloing, maybe this is your inner monologue. But either way, we go from discussing sort of the nuts and bolts of the functionality, like, oh, I think we're missing an end over there, maybe that context doesn't need to be there. And we start discussing larger concerns. This method started out with a name that made sense, but now it's not quite right. Maybe we can move it over there. The second thing that changes is the keys that we press on the keyboard, right? We go from entering code, entering logic, putting in our eaches and our injects, and we change to like moving code around, between files, between classes. And the third thing that changes is our physical posture. When you're doing the red, green, your hands are on the keyboard, you're getting close to the screen, you're looking at the code. But when you're refactoring, you lean back a little bit, you take your hands off the keyboard, you look at the code without changing it. Fundamentally, what's happening, of course, is that in these two modes, you are thinking differently, in different ways about the code. Red, green, you're operating in closed mode. You're getting stuff done. You go into refactoring, and you're operating in the open mode. Just like Twyla Tharp's process is a structured way for her to spend some time in open mode and some time in closed mode, red, green, refactor is a structured way of moving us between the closed and open modes when we're writing code. It's a habit that we have that gives us room to think creatively every time we write code. Now, there's one piece we haven't talked about of this puzzle, and that is when you're in the open mode and everything is possible, how do you proceed? The process has given you this creative space. How do you get that lightning to strike? And that is often a matter of being able to shift your context in an appropriate way, right? To consider the code you just wrote in a larger context. This shift is the germ of creativity, no matter what type of creativity we're talking about. Painting and comedy and poetry and all of these creative works gain their power by showing the viewer a context they hadn't seen before. Let me give you another example. Humor. Everyone loves a good light bulb joke, right? How many folk singers does it take to change a light bulb? Answer, 5. 1 to change the bulb, and 4 to sing about how much better the old one was. How many anarchists does it take to change a light bulb? Answer: none, because everyone knows they never change anything. And finally, I'm going to take the cheap shot. That wasn't it. How many enterprise developers does it take to change a light bulb? Answer: we're not going to change it. We think it works. It's the shift of context between the setup and the punchline that makes jokes funny. So once you get into creative mode, that's step 1. But then if you want to be able to come up with these flashes of insights, if you want to write the jokes, you need to be able to make that context switch once you're there. If I were a management consultant, which I'm not, I'd call it thinking outside the box, and then you'd have to shoot me, I think. But it's really just context shifting that allows you to see a brilliant and unintuitive situation of the problem at hand. Now, I'll state the obvious and say that different developers have different levels of skill with this type of thinking. I've been pair programming full-time for more than 3 years at this point. I counted it up. I've paired with about 150 different people. And some of them, when we're sitting there together and we're looking at a refactoring, they always seem to come up with a pretty decent solution. It feels a lot like luck sometimes. And this, it's a big project, there's lots of code, no one person knows all of it, but the lucky people always seem to have just been looking at some code in a completely different part of the project that had a pattern that might work here if we changed something. So I was thinking about that. Then I ran across another piece of interesting science that looked at what's different between people who consider themselves to be lucky and people who consider themselves to be unlucky. And the first thing they looked at is whether people who think they are lucky are, in fact, luckier. And the way that they did that was by giving each of these people a section of the newspaper. And they said, okay, look through this section of the newspaper, figure out how many photographs are in this section, and then come back to the researcher with your answer. And on the second page of the section of the newspaper was a half-page advertisement with no photographs, but very large text that said, stop, there are 16 pictures in this section of the newspaper, please go tell the researcher. And what they discovered was that people who think they are lucky were much more likely to see that and save themselves the tedium of actually going through and counting the photographs than the people who thought they were unlucky. And so then, having established that there are differences in luck, for whatever that's worth, the study then tried to find differences in the people that explained this phenomenon. And just like the science around creativity, turns out that there are no intrinsic differences between these two groups of people, but there are differences in behavior. And that means that just like creativity, luck is a skill that you can practice and get better at. It turns out that people who are lucky deliberately seek novelty in all parts of their lives. So given the choice of 2 paths to walk, they will pick the one they haven't gone down before. Presented with a menu, they will pick a dish they haven't eaten before. Now these are little things. But the theory here is that by deliberately exposing themselves to things that are outside of their immediate comfort zone, they are changing the mode in which their brain works. And it becomes more open. And that means that they notice things that they wouldn't normally notice. And the end result is that they are more able to see context shifts, and that makes them more creative, more unusual, effective problem solvers. They're setting themselves up for that lightning strike. So you can practice being creative, and you can practice being lucky, and that sets you up to take best advantage of both of these modes of thought. Because we want all of these things. Even the tunnel vision and the immaturity, we have these really hard problems that we need to solve, and we want the whole richness of human thought brought to bear on these problems. And so you might think, well, okay, but how is red, green refactor exactly going to get me all the way there? Well, it turns out there are other ways that you can introduce creative space into your projects besides that. The development process at Pivotal Labs, which is what I did for the last 3 years, has a lot in common with extreme programming. So on a typical day, how it works is that developers pair up, they take whatever story is on the top of the backlog, whatever it is, and they work on it. They do the red, green refactor cycle, they finish it, they deliver it, and then they go back to the backlog and they pick the next story that's at the top and they start working on that. I call this the story mill, because when you do this process, you just churn through stories, and it feels amazing. It feels absolutely fantastic to get so much stuff done. You do this 8 hours a day, and you get a lot of stuff done. But once a week in this process, we do something slightly different. We do a 1-hour retrospective. And this is a meeting that is our chance to consider how our process is working and how we'd like to change it. sort of meta level, right? It's a process that's considering the process itself. And I could not do this process, let alone do it continuously for 3 years, without those retrospectives, because the story mill is closed mode, and it is really, really closed. And retros are the open mode that balances that out, because no process ever works the same for 2 different organizations. But it's usually not obvious when you're in the thick of it what exactly needs to be changed. So doing these retros once a week is a structured way to introduce creative thinking into our process, just like the refactor stage is a structured way to introduce creative thinking into our coding. Because process, when it's done right, is what enables us to be creative, and being creative is what enables us to build great software. The process should give us that space. It teaches us the habits of creative people. And if that's not what yours feels like, you should think about refactoring it in that direction. Because if you're at a company that's growing or is already big, and you start needing to add more structure to your development process, there are 1,000 ways to do it. And the right thing to do for your organization depends on your people, your market, your financial structure. But the one fundamental thing that's important is that you need to make sure that the process you add is enabling rather than squashing creativity. Make sure what you're adding isn't squeezing all the fun out of your development, because it's that fun and that play that makes it possible for us to write great software. And finally, as developers, it's our job to set ourselves up so that the lightning can strike when it needs to, right? What that means is you need to introduce enough novelty into your life to take advantage of the creative time that the process gives you. You don't need to go to art school or anything like that. Here's some things you can do when you're working to make you more open. First is look at parts of your code base beyond what's just immediately in front of you. If you see a method being used and you don't know where it's implemented, go look, right? Spelunk through parts of the code you haven't seen in a while. Fill your mind with the raw material for creative thought. Similarly, talk to people who aren't programmers. Go to lunch with some salespeople. Try and figure out, get outside of your little bubble of developer land. Second, try to vary what you do as much as possible. Switch projects every couple of months if you can. If you can't, spend some time writing JavaScript if you're a back-end developer, or do some SQL optimization if you're a front-end developer. The rule here is that when you start feeling comfortable, it's time to move on. And similarly to that, vary what you do during the day. Don't spend 8 hours a day sitting in front of your keyboard. Get up, get outside at lunch, take breaks, walk around the block. Doing different things during your day helps you get into the mode where you can actually be more productive when you're sitting in front of the computer. And finally, seek out teams that have people that don't look like you. Now, this is an interesting hack. There's been some research that tells us that if you have 2 problem-solving teams and what they do requires creative thought, and one team is better qualified on paper, but they all look the same, and the other team is less qualified on paper, but the members have some kind of visual difference between them, which means things like height and race and gender and ability and things like that, then the team that is less qualified on paper will consistently do better. And the reason for that is the same as the science behind creativity and luck, and that is by deliberately putting yourself into a place where you are not as comfortable with the interaction modes between you, you are putting your brain into a place where it is more open and will be better able to come up with creative solutions. And finally, find ways to keep the creativity and fun in your job, because we won't solve these important problems without it. I remember I had a client once who was fairly new to the process, and we had a story come up to the top of the backlog. And it was really important that we get something done by the end of the day for him to show his manager. And it was a hard problem. We were setting up the basics of an API for a mobile app, and he really needed it to be done. We really needed to get it right. And so a pair of developers picked it up, and they worked on it for an hour or so, and then they got up and they went over to go play ping pong. And I was in the kitchen at the time, and the client came over looking very worried. He looked at me, and he looked at the guys playing ping pong, and he said, this is a really important story. It's really important that we have enough time to get this done right by the end of the day. And I said, yep, that is why they are playing ping pong. And that's all I got. Thank you very much. Have a fantastic rest of the day.